On the night of Monday, December 2nd, 2013, 59-year-old Patty Wheelington walked across a gravel parking lot toward her favorite place in Texarkana, Arkansas, the Guys and Dolls Square Dance Club. Patty was the owner of the club, a spot where club members from town got together each week to socialize and square dance, which is a traditional type of partner dance that had once been extremely popular in the American South and West. Patty had managed the club for years with her husband Ray, but Ray had died a year earlier, leaving Patty to run things on her own with some help from the most dedicated club members. The couple had always considered Guys and Dolls to be like their second home, and now that Ray was gone, Patty felt like this club was the most important thing in her life. And tonight was her first day back at the club since taking a short trip for Thanksgiving, so she was looking forward to seeing some of her friends and getting back into her weekly routine. Patty opened the front doors, stepped inside, and her face immediately lit up. This old-fashioned dance hall was housed in a metal building that almost looked like a large storage unit from the outside, but the inside was bright and festive. String lights and decorations hung along the walls, and Patty saw a group of older women dressed in colorful western skirts and petticoats, and older men wearing their cowboy boots and hats. And everybody was socializing and laughing and having a great time while filling up their paper plates with food. The moment Patty walked inside, the club members turned, saw her, and shouted hello, and some rushed over to greet her like she'd been away for months. They told her they'd been anxiously waiting for her to come back because they hadn't known what to do with themselves while the club was closed over the holiday. She told them how much she missed them too, and thanked them for getting everything set up for the night. As she talked, Patty heard somebody calling her name. She looked over at a long table lined with food, and she saw two of her closest friends waving to her. They were Phyllis Neighbors and Virginia Hyatt. Patty went over to the table, and the women hugged each other and talked about their Thanksgiving holidays until Patty noticed it was almost time to start the night's dance. Patty walked across the dance hall, got up on the stage and tapped the mic, and then welcomed everyone back to the club. And immediately everybody cheered and took their spots on the dance floor with their partners. Well, at least almost all of them cheered. As Patty looked out from the stage, she noticed one of the couples whispering to each other while pointing her way. Patty almost tripped over her words as she began wondering if that couple was talking about her. But she quickly caught herself and figured she was just reading too much into it. So she wrapped up her welcome back speech and then led club members in saying the Pledge of Allegiance, which they did every time before they danced together. Once the pledge was finished, Patty, with a huge smile on her face, started the music and kicked off the dancing for the night. And as she watched everybody out on the dance floor, this sense of almost complete calm came over her. She knew most people would laugh at her for thinking this, but she believed being up on the stage and running this square dance club was her true calling. It was a way for her to give back to her community and to help the people she loved continue to thrive. The next morning, around 7:50 a.m., Patty stood in the kitchen of her home and poured herself a fresh mug of coffee. She slid her phone and pack of cigarettes into the pocket of her bathrobe and walked outside onto her front porch. A blast of cold winter air immediately hit her, so she pulled her bathrobe tighter across her body, sat down in a swivel chair, and set her coffee on a small wooden table and lit a cigarette. Now, in the past, on a cold day like this, Patty would have very likely just smoked inside of her home. But more than 5 years earlier, a raging fire had ripped through her home and destroyed half of it. Now, the blaze wasn't caused by a lit cigarette. In fact, the fire had started while Patty and her husband Ray weren't even at home. But they had hired a good friend of theirs from the Square Dance Club, who was a contractor, to restore their house, and he'd done such an amazing job overseeing the construction project that the house looked almost brand new. So now, Patty would never risk lighting a cigarette inside, no matter what the weather was outside. Patty smoked her cigarette and sipped her coffee, and just when she started to feel like she was really waking up, her phone rang. She put her coffee down and grabbed her phone out of her pocket. She looked at the caller ID and saw it was one of her many friends from the dance club, so she answered it. A few minutes into the conversation, Patty heard a car slowing down just beyond the trees at the edge of her property that isolated her house from the main road. Patty's friend kept talking on the phone, but Patty was no longer listening. She heard the car turning up her long gravel driveway toward her house, and she wondered who would be visiting so early without telling her they were coming by first. Patty watched as this car emerged from the trees and headed straight towards her. and as it did, Patty immediately told her friend on the phone that she'd just have to call them back. Over 7 hours later, at around 3:30 p.m., Patty's close friend, Phyllis Neighbors, received a call from a mutual friend from the dance club. And as soon as Phyllis answered the phone, this mutual friend said he was very worried about Patty. Patty was supposed to pick him up to take him to a doctor's appointment, but she had never showed up and was not returning his phone calls, and this was totally unlike her. Over the next hour, Phyllis tried to reach Patty several times without any success. So eventually she called another friend from the club, Barbara Ricketts, and told her that she couldn't get in touch with Patty, and she had this bad feeling that something might be wrong. Barbara said she had also been trying to get in touch with Patty and had not been able to reach her all day. And so at this point, Phyllis said that she was just going to drive out to Patty's house to see what was going on. But Barbara told Phyllis to hold on a minute and stay put and wait for her. She wasn't letting her go out there alone. By the time Phyllis and Barbara finally got to Patty's place, it was starting to get pretty dark. Barbara drove slowly and carefully up Patty's long gravel driveway because the light coming from inside Patty's house was actually the only thing guiding her way toward it. She parked right behind Patty's car, and the two women got out and started walking toward Patty's house. When they got close to the porch, they noticed something lying at the foot of the front door. Phyllis squinted and thought it looked like a bunched-up rug. Phyllis climbed onto the steps to get a better look at the object, and when she reached the middle step, she suddenly froze. And then she gasped and quickly turned her face away. She stumbled back down the steps, grabbed her phone, and dialed 911. Texarkana police cruisers and an ambulance converged on Patty's house within minutes of Phyllis's call. A police officer stepped out of his car and turned on his flashlight. He scanned the area and saw Barbara sitting inside her car and crying, and then he saw Phyllis standing in front of the porch. Her hands were shaking and she was muttering to herself. The officer, along with 2 EMTs, began walking toward the house, and as they did, Phyllis looked up and saw them and went right over to them and then pointed back at the front porch and said they might as well send the ambulance away because they were too late. The officer walked past Phyllis, reached the front steps, and right away he saw what she was talking about. In front of the door to the house, there was a woman in a bathrobe, lying face up, gripping a cigarette in her right hand and clutching her chest with her left. And the officer noticed that her skin was pale and blotchy. One of the EMTs walked over and bent down to feel for a pulse, but he was already confident he was not going to find one. And when he actually felt the woman's cold, waxy skin, it confirmed that she was dead. The officer kneeled down and shined his light on the body, and he saw there were bloodstains in the woman's bathrobe and blood spatter on the wooden slats beneath her. And it became very clear that this woman did not die of natural causes. Minutes later, another car pulled up the driveway and 2 men stepped out. Texarkana police detectives, Paul Knoll and Jason Hack, who were about as physically mismatched as 2 people could be. Knoll was round and bald, and Hack was tall and thin. They looked like an odd pairing, but these 2 men were actually almost always on the same page, and they were both sharp and meticulous investigators. Texarkana, Arkansas only had a few murders every year, so whenever Knoll and Hack got a call for a homicide, they knew it was not going to be an ordinary day at the office. And as they sized up their new crime scene, they could tell right away that this murder seemed especially out of the ordinary. The dead woman looked much older than the average murder victim in the area, and this neighborhood was more affluent than where they usually responded to violent crimes. Knoll and Hack quickly met with Phyllis and Barbara, but both women seemed so shaken they could barely talk. However, Phyllis did offer, in a very trembling voice, that the deceased was their friend, a woman named Patty Wheelington. Hack looked at the time and figured he should start canvassing the neighborhood while the neighbors were still awake. He told Knoll he'd be back in about an hour. As Hack walked to his car, he was struck by how eerily quiet it was. Even during the drive here, he had noticed how the woods seemed to isolate everything and how much land there was between each house. And as he pulled out onto the road to begin his canvassing, he didn't feel optimistic that any of Patty's neighbors would have witnessed anything. Meanwhile, Nall stepped onto the front porch and began examining Patty's body and the area around her, trying to make sense of what had happened. For Nall, there was no mistaking the 5 small, perfectly round wounds on Patty's body for anything other than gunshot wounds. He observed a bullet hole in the swivel chair where he guessed Patty had been sitting, and then another bullet hole in the bedroom window directly behind the chair. It looked as though the first shot was fired while Patty was seated, and it missed her. He then noticed another bullet lodged inside the front door of the house, which looked like yet another missed shot. Nall took a step back, trying to picture the crime as it happened. He looked down at Patty and saw the cigarette wedged between her fingers, now burnt down to the filter. He noticed the way Patty's body was positioned, face up, with one knee raised, and Nall visualized Patty leaping up from her chair after the first shots were fired and desperately trying to retreat into her house as more bullets hit her until she collapsed onto her back. From how quickly it looked like things had unfolded, and how the gunshot wounds appeared to have been fired from close range, this crime looked very intentional. It seemed like whoever had killed Patty had showed up on a mission, like they'd come here to kill Patty. Nall looked through the hole in the back of the swivel chair, and then repositioned himself until he could see through the hole in the chair and also through the hole in the bedroom window, both at the same time, so they're aligned. This way, he could get a sense of the bullet's trajectory into the house. And while he was doing this, headlights suddenly swept across the porch as the coroner's van pulled up to the house. The coroner got out and met with Nall, and Nall told him he was free to remove the body. So, with the help of 2 police officers, the coroner lifted up Patty's body, placed it into a cadaver bag, and carried it off the porch. With the front door now clear, Nall entered the home and went straight to the bedroom, where he found a .38 caliber slug on the bedroom floor, right where he calculated he would find it. He then began doing a walkthrough of the house, going from room to room, looking for any signs of ransacking or burglary. But nothing appeared out of place. In fact, it didn't look like Patty's killer ever entered the home. It was as if they drove up to the house, exited their car, immediately began firing, and once Patty was down, they got back into their car and drove away. Just as Nall started a search of the kitchen, about an hour after he'd arrived, his partner, Detective Hack, walked in and quickly brought Nall up to speed on what he had learned during his canvass of the neighborhood. Several of Patty's neighbors reported hearing gunshots around 8 a.m. that morning. After hearing this, Nall looked over at the half-empty pot of coffee still on the kitchen counter. He'd seen Patty lying dead in her bathrobe, and she had obviously been dead for at least several hours before she was discovered, so it definitely seemed like she'd been killed that morning, possibly around 8 a.m. But then Nall wondered why none of these neighbors had called the police if they heard gunshots that morning. Hack said he'd asked the neighbors the same question, and the explanation was pretty simple. People in that area fired their guns into the air all the time to scare geese out of their gardens or deer off their front lawns, so hearing gunshots would not exactly be cause for alarm. Then Nall started updating his partner on what he had found on the porch and inside the house as the 2 men searched the kitchen. But then suddenly, Nall stopped talking. He picked up several pieces of paper that were lying on the counter near the coffee pot, and as he read them over, he turned to Hack with a smile on his face. It looked like he had just found a huge piece of the puzzle. Nall handed over the papers to his partner, and after reading it over, Hack as well got the same look on his face. The first piece of paper was an invoice for a locksmith. Just a day earlier, Patty had paid someone to change all the locks on the doors to her house. Hack looked up at his partner with his eyebrows raised. If Patty was suddenly changing her locks at the house she'd lived in for years, it very likely meant she was afraid of someone who she knew well enough to maybe have a key to her house. Nall nodded in agreement and told him to wait until he saw what was on the other papers he'd handed him. And as Detective Hack started reading those papers, his mouth fell open and he started shaking his head side to side, because what he was looking at was Patty's life insurance policy. Each of the beneficiaries listed in the policy stood to gain $20,000 in the event of Patty's death, and the last 2 names on the list were Phyllis Neighbors and Barbara Ricketts, Patty's friends, who also were the 2 women who had found her body. Nall and Hack arranged for police escorts to bring Phyllis and Barbara down to the station, and when the 2 women got there, Nall and Hack interviewed them separately in 2 different rooms. Phyllis told Detective Nall that she had first met Patty at the Guys and Dolls Square Dance Club about a decade earlier, and she had been very close with both Patty and Patty's husband, Ray. And so had Barbara. Nall asked Phyllis if she knew that she and Barbara were beneficiaries on Patty's life insurance policy, and Phyllis began laughing and nodding. Nall couldn't tell if this laughter was maybe nervous laughter, or if it was designed to mask just how important this money may be to her. Phyllis kept on laughing and said Nall's question had reminded her that when she first learned that she and Barbara were beneficiaries, she had jokingly said, "Oh, real cool, Patty. You're younger than all of us. We'll all be dead before we see this money." Nall smiled at Phyllis and sort of played along like this was a good joke, but secretly, he thought that everything Phyllis was saying and doing made her seem a little bit suspicious. So, after she stopped laughing, Nall asked her to go through her day to help him establish a timeline, hoping that, if she was involved, she would implicate herself. Phyllis said she woke up at 8 that morning, and then sometime around 10, she sent Patty a text message. Phyllis said she didn't really think anything of it when Patty did not reply. She just assumed that Patty was still asleep, and then she got distracted when her friend came over to watch a television game show with her. Nall nodded and wrote everything down that Phyllis said, but privately, he wondered if maybe she had sent that text message to Patty just to throw off investigators and make it look like she'd been innocently trying to reach her friend on the morning of her murder. In the next room over, Detective Hack was asking Barbara a similar round of questions. And, like Phyllis, Barbara had an alibi. She said she was with her husband all day, and her husband could verify this. Hack leaned back in his chair and looked across the table at Barbara. As much as he tried to picture Barbara as Patty's killer, he just couldn't see it. Barbara reminded him of his grandma, and she looked so utterly shaken by her friend's death that it was hard not to feel sorry for her. But Hack had enough experience to know that he should never take anyone's emotional state at face value. This could all just be an act. And so as he sat listening to Barbara talk, he found himself calculating in his head how much money Barbara may have been willing to pay someone else to kill Patty in order to still turn a profit on that $20,000 life insurance payout. It was after 9 p.m. by the time Detectives Nall and Hack wrapped up their interviews, but they didn't want to stop working right now when they felt like their investigation was really starting to take shape. And so after Phyllis and Barbara left the police station, the detectives began going through the text messages and recent calls on Patty's phone. They hoped they might find something that would give them more information on Patty's two friends. But none of the text messages between the women seemed in any way out of the ordinary. Instead, the detectives discovered something strange that they hadn't even been looking for. One of Patty's most frequent correspondents was someone she had saved in her contacts only as MF. Patty and MF communicated multiple times every day, and it was clear by reading their messages that this was more than just a friendly relationship. This was romantic. And it was also suspiciously discreet. Everyone else in Patty's contact list had been saved under their first and last names, except for this one person. Hack ran MF's phone number through a reverse directory, but all he was able to determine was that it was a mobile phone number, because the directory only gave him the name of the carrier, not the name that the phone number was registered to. And so he would need help from the phone company to find out who this number actually belonged to. But he also knew at this time of night that could be very difficult to make happen, and it could take a while. So Hack handed over that task to other members of the investigative team. And while he and Detective Nall waited for the results, they started tracking down and calling members of the Guys and Dolls Square Dance Club. Even though it was getting late, several of the members answered their phones and were actually quite eager to help the police. None of the members could think of anyone with the initials MF, but Hack and Nall quickly discovered that these people loved to gossip. Several of them told the detectives that rumors had been circulating for a while that Patty was having an affair with a married club member, a man named James Hyatt. And as soon as Detective Nall and Hack heard this name, they stared at each other in shock. This was not the first time in this investigation that they had run across James Hyatt, because James Hyatt was the third beneficiary on Patty's life insurance policy, right behind Phyllis and Barbara. In the event of Patty's death, James, like Phyllis and Barbara, stood to receive $20,000. And so now the detectives had three possible suspects: Phyllis, Barbara, and James. And they also started to wonder if maybe all three of them had conspired together to kill Patty for the insurance money. In their conversations with Guys and Dolls club members, Nall and Hack learned that James was married and he had known Patty for years. Patty and her husband, Ray, used to go out on double dates with James and his wife, and they had become even closer with James in 2008 when they hired him as a contractor to help restore their fire-ravaged house. In fact, Patty and Ray had trusted James so much that they had made him the executor of their wills. This definitely seemed like a guy who Patty and Ray might have given a house key to. So the detectives thought, maybe James was the person Patty had changed her locks to try to keep out. As the detectives were working through this potential theory in Nall's office, the door opened and an excited young cop walked in. He said they had gotten lucky. The phone company had been able to help them and gave them the name connected to the MF phone number in Patty's contacts. And it was a burner phone for James Hyatt. Nall and Hack immediately got in their car and drove across town towards James's house. They still considered Phyllis and Barbara suspects, and they thought there was a chance the women had worked together with James. But based on the text messages the detectives had found between Patty and this MF person, and now the burner phone, it seemed pretty clear that James and Patty were having an affair, which automatically made James a major suspect in his own right. On top of that, it made it even more likely James would have had a key to Patty's house, and as a final strike against him, he had something to gain financially from Patty's death. The detectives arrived at James's house, but his wife Virginia came to the door and told them James wasn't home. In fact, she had no idea where he was, and she was starting to worry that he might have just left town or something without telling her. And now, the detectives realized they might be looking at a fleeing suspect. They told Virginia to contact them if she heard from her husband and to please keep her phone close by in case they needed to follow up with her. And Virginia said she would. Nall and Hack got in their car and headed right back to the station. It was late and they were both very tired, but now this was starting to feel like a case they could close before sunrise. They just had to find James. Detective Nall walked into his office and called James's main phone, not the burner phone. There was no answer, but Nall was relentless. He just kept calling over and over and over, and finally, after a bunch of tries, Nall heard James answer. Before James could say anything other than hello, Nall introduced himself and told James why he was calling. But James cut him off, saying he'd already gotten the news of Patty's death, and so this would just have to wait, because he was out of town. Nall couldn't believe how arrogant and dismissive James sounded, and he was not convinced James was actually out of town. But either way, the detective knew he could not let James off the phone and risk having him disappear for good. Usually, Nall liked to interview his primary suspects in person, but he knew he could not wait for a face-to-face meeting with James. So Nall just launched into an interview right there on the phone. He told James that police knew all about the burner phone and his affair with Patty. There was no point in trying to hide those things. James immediately went silent, and there was a long pause, and then when he started talking again, all of the arrogance Nall had sensed just minutes ago was gone. James sighed and admitted that he and Patty were romantically involved. He only had the burner phone and the different name in her contacts to protect Patty's reputation. After all, he said, people in this town don't look too kindly upon adultery, and the other woman often gets blamed in these situations. So he just never wanted any of this to get out to protect her. Detective Nall doubted that it was really Patty's reputation James was trying to protect, and not his own, or his marriage. He asked James if Patty had ever demanded that he leave his wife, but James said she hadn't. In fact, he said Patty pleaded with him specifically to stay with his wife. Finally, Nall asked James where he was on the morning Patty had been killed. James said he'd been in Florida, where he still was, and so he was 1,000 miles away from Texarkana when Patty died. Nall knew that there was an easy way to either prove or disprove this, and that was by getting the location data for James's mobile numbers and seeing what cell towers they pinged. So he told James one more time that he needed to get back to Arkansas right away. As soon as Nall hung up, he and Detective Hack put in a request for a subpoena so they could get James's cell phone records. They knew that request would take a little time to be fulfilled, so in the meantime, they reached back out to James's wife, Virginia. They said they knew it was late, but they needed to talk to her. And not long after the call, The detectives drove back to James and Virginia's house, picked her up, and brought her back to the station. And by the time they arrived there, Detectives Knoll and Hack weren't even sure if it was considered late at night or early in the morning. They just thanked her for coming in at such a strange time, and they led her into a large office with a conference table. Virginia sat down across from them, and for a second, neither of the detectives spoke. This was not a situation that either of them wanted to be in. But, finally, Hack looked across the table at Virginia and asked her if she was aware that her husband James had been having an affair with Patty. Virginia gave a little smile and said she knew it might sound strange to them, but she knew all about the affair. Hack and Knoll shared a quick look, like what was going on here, and then Virginia told them that she and Patty were friends, and there were no problems between them at all. Now, neither of the detectives had expected this response, but they knew there were all different kinds of marriages out there. Maybe Virginia and James had an open marriage, or maybe James's affair with Patty somehow made his and Virginia's marriage stronger. They were not there to pick apart the exact nature of this relationship, but they did think there was a chance Virginia might have information that could directly connect James to Patty's murder, even if she didn't know it. And so Hack asked if Virginia remembered where her husband was when Patty was killed. Had Virginia seen James or even called or texted with him? Virginia said she hadn't seen James at all. She had woken up around 8 a.m. that morning, and she drove straight to a fast food restaurant to buy breakfast for her mother, who lived in a nursing home. After spending some time with her mom, she had gone home, and she said James had already been gone when she woke up, and he wasn't home when she got back, and they hadn't talked on the phone at all. The detectives excused themselves and stepped out into the hall. They had some new information, but nothing that would enable them to close the case or prove if any of their potential suspects were actually where they claimed to be at the time of the murder. They needed James's cell phone data. If his phone had been picked up by one of the cell phone towers near Patty's house on the morning of the murder, they would know he'd lied to them about being in Florida at the time of the murder. Luckily, it didn't take long for the phone company to come through yet again. Now, almost exactly 1 day after Patty's murder, Detectives Hack and Knoll received James's cell phone tower data, which showed his location and movements throughout the morning of the murder. They also obtained surveillance footage from multiple locations around town, and that footage was the final piece of evidence they needed. It had taken just 24 hours, but the detectives now knew who had killed Patty Willington. Based on video footage, cell phone data, the interviews conducted, and other evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Patty on the morning of December 3rd, 2013. Just before sunrise, the killer got out of bed after yet another sleepless night, and they told themselves there was only one way to find peace again. They had to kill Patty Willington. They went to their closet and collected their .38 revolver. As the sun began to rise, they slipped the gun into their pocket, marched out to their car, and began driving towards Patty's house on the outskirts of the city. The killer pulled into the long driveway leading to Patty's house, and as they approached, they saw Patty sitting on the porch, smoking a cigarette and talking on her phone. The killer got out of their car and began walking toward Patty, who quickly put her phone down and greeted the killer. But the killer was not interested in talking. Instead, they drew their revolver and aimed it at Patty. Patty saw the gun and tried to reason with them, but the killer just fired off a shot. The bullet missed Patty and went through the bedroom window behind her, and Patty jumped up with her cigarette still in her hand, but before she could even turn, the killer had fired again, and this time the bullet hit Patty in the chest, puncturing her lung. Patty clutched her chest and struggled to breathe. She lurched toward her front door, but the killer kept on firing, hitting Patty 4 more times, including a bullet that struck Patty right in the heart. Patty's legs buckled and she collapsed on the porch, still clutching her cigarette in one hand and her chest in the other. And as the killer watched Patty fall, a sudden sense of peace did come over them. The killer walked back to their car, started the engine, and drove away as Patty lied at the foot of her front door, dying. A little while later, the killer stopped along an isolated road, disposed of their gun, and then continued on home. Over an hour later, at about 9:15 a.m., the killer drove to a fast food drive-thru and ordered a sausage biscuit. And at 9:42 a.m., the killer walked into a nursing home to see their mother and give her the fast food breakfast. And later that day, the killer returned home and waited for the sun to set, looking forward to their first good night's sleep since they discovered that their husband was having an affair with Patty Wheelington. James Hyatt, who had been a strong suspect at the beginning of the investigation, did not kill Patty. His wife, Virginia, did. James's cell phone data proved he was in Florida at the time of Patty's death, just like he had told the police. This information led investigators to immediately turn their focus on Virginia, who they had considered a suspect from the moment they learned she knew about James and Patty's affair. So investigators obtained surveillance footage from the McDonald's drive-thru and the nursing home, places Virginia told detectives she had visited on the morning Patty was killed, and those videos showed that Virginia had visited both of those places, but she lied about the times that she was there. And surveillance footage from a convenience store along the route between Virginia's house and Patty's showed Virginia's car heading towards Patty's house right around the time it was believed Patty was killed, and then also driving back to her own house not long after. With that information, police served a search warrant on Virginia's house. Although they didn't find the revolver, they did find a box of .38 caliber ammunition, and they found the blouse that Virginia was seen wearing in the surveillance footage from that morning. They sent the blouse to the crime lab, and it came back positive for gunshot residue. It turned out, ever since Virginia began to suspect that her husband was having an affair with their good friend Patty, Virginia became increasingly possessive and unstable. And James, who had been married to Virginia for 41 years, had begun to grow afraid of his wife, to the point where he began sleeping in a separate bedroom and even began locking his bedroom door at night to keep his wife out. At Thanksgiving dinner with her in-laws, a week before Patty's murder, Virginia had taken James's sisters aside and told them she was concerned that James was going to commit suicide. But James's sisters knew him well enough to know that they did not believe this, and when they talked it over with James, the family became convinced that Virginia was actually planning to kill James and cover it up by the idea that he had killed himself. So, as a result of this, James had left town to stay with his sister in Florida, and while he was down there, he filed for divorce. And by coincidence, Patty had just happened to leave town around the same time as James left for Florida, which led Virginia to believe that Patty and James had run away together. So Virginia began calling Patty repeatedly, leaving voicemail after voicemail, begging Patty to return her husband to her. On December 2nd, Virginia was served with the divorce papers. And then that night, she was at the Square Dance Club, where she knew the other club members were whispering and gossiping about her husband's affair with Patty, and so she decided it was time to kill Patty. And the following morning, she would. Virginia was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On a sunny afternoon in October of 2015, a 39-year-old man named Richard Jones walked along the perimeter of the yard inside of the state prison in Kansas, where Richard was serving time for a robbery. Up ahead, Richard could see there was a small basketball court with one hoop on it, and on the blacktop were dozens of other inmates that were exercising and chatting and socializing, and Richard actually knew most of them because he had been in prison for 16 years now, and Richard was also a very likable guy who was very outgoing and personable, and so he made friends really easily, even in prison. And so as Richard continued his walk in the direction of the basketball court, he saw one of the guys on the blacktop broke free from the group and began moving towards Richard. And Richard immediately recognized who it was. It was his good friend, Steve. And Richard was about to give him a friendly wave when he noticed Steve looked really mad. And so Richard actually just stopped and stared at Steve as he slowly approached him, and as he got closer, Richard could see Steve's fists were balled up and his face was in a scowl. I mean, Steve looked like he was coming over to fight Richard. And so when Steve got about 10 feet away from Richard, Richard actually spoke up before Steve could say anything, and he said, "Steve, what's going on? Why are you so upset?" Steve was kind of a hothead, and Richard knew that, but a lot of times, even when he got mad about things, it would blow over really quickly. And so this was kind of routine, but Richard just couldn't think of a reason for why Steve would be mad at him. And so Steve walks right up to Richard and he goes, "Oh, so now you want to talk to me?" Richard was immediately confused and kind of turned his head sideways and was like, "What?" Steve stared at Richard, kind of expecting Richard to eventually apologize or something, but eventually he noticed that Richard really was not sure what he was talking about. And so Steve was like, "This morning, I went up to you at the cafeteria line, I tried to talk to you, and you completely blew me off and walked away in front of a big group of people. That really embarrassed me and made me look bad." And Richard was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't even see you this morning. I don't know where this is coming from." Steve was not buying it, and he was like, "Richard, I know it was you. I saw you this morning. I spoke to you this morning. You did that." And Richard was like, "No, really, Steve, I'm sorry. I have no idea what this is about." And so these two continued to go back and forth on this. And then at some point, they both kind of noticed that they were drawing lots of attention because they are in prison and any sort of confrontation immediately draws eyeballs. And so when they noticed other inmates were kind of beginning to walk over to see what was going on and the guards were starting to notice, Steve just said, "You know what, Richard, fine. I guess I must have made a mistake. No big deal." And he turned and he ran back to the basketball court. After Steve had left, Richard continued his walk around the perimeter, but that exchange with Steve had really weirded him out, because this was actually not the first time something like this had happened. It all started a month ago when an inmate that Richard didn't know came up to him like he definitely knew him and said to Richard, "Hey, how's your grandmother? I heard she fell down, is she okay?" And at first, Richard was like, "Wait a minute, is my grandmother okay? Did she fall?" But then Richard eventually realized that this inmate thought Richard was someone that he wasn't. Now, at first, Richard thought this was just kind of like a weird one-off event, but every few days after this first time, something else would happen. Either an inmate who Richard didn't know would come up to him and be really friendly with him, as if they knew Richard, but Richard clearly didn't know them, or someone Richard did know would come up to him and accuse him of odd behavior that Richard couldn't remember doing. Like the interaction he had with Steve when Steve came up and said, "You snubbed me in the lunch line." And so after Richard's interaction with Steve, Richard began to think, wait a minute, is someone screwing with me? Is that what's been going on? The next morning during breakfast, Richard decided not to sit where he normally did, and instead he sat on the very far side in the corner of the cafeteria to basically just be able to people watch all the people inside the cafeteria. And then that afternoon, when Richard was outside, instead of walking around the perimeter like he liked to do, he just sat in a central location and just constantly scanned the whole yard. Now, Richard didn't really know what he was actually looking for. He just figured, maybe I'll see something suspicious, I'll see someone staring at me for too long, or I'll see someone I don't know talking to my friends. Something will tip me off to what's been going on for the past couple of weeks. But despite all this careful people watching he was doing, Richard didn't see anything suspicious. Until 1 week after the interaction Richard had with Steve about snubbing him in the lunch line, Richard was sitting in the cafeteria again when he noticed something very strange on the other side of the cafeteria. And when he saw it, he just stood up and stared, and he felt his heart starting to race faster, and he felt his breath speeding up. And Steve actually was sitting next to him and said, "Hey, Richard, what's going on?" And Richard couldn't even find the words. He just raised his arm up and pointed to the other side of the room. When Richard had originally been arrested 16 years earlier, it was for robbing someone in a Walmart parking lot. Richard had always claimed he did not do it, but multiple witnesses had pulled Richard out of a lineup saying, "That's the guy." And the woman who actually got robbed told police she overheard the getaway driver yelling to Rick, the man who had robbed her, to get in the car so they could leave. And Rick is a nickname for Richard. Richard had insisted he was at a barbecue in another state at the time of this robbery, and so it really couldn't have been him, but the evidence was just overwhelming, and so eventually he was convicted. Richard had never been able to understand why so many people 16 years earlier had insisted that he was the one who committed that crime. And more recently, he couldn't understand why his friends, like Steve, were accusing him of doing things that he didn't remember doing. But that night in the jail cafeteria, when Richard spotted something on the other side of the room, suddenly everything over the last 16 years made perfect sense. Richard really was an innocent man. He did not rob that woman in the Walmart parking lot. His doppelganger had. A doppelganger is someone who looks exactly like you, but they're not actually related to you. It's just genetic chance that somebody else on the planet looks just like you. And it just so happened that Richard's doppelganger, who was this man named Ricky Amos, so it just so happened as well that the doppelganger shared basically the same first name, Ricky and Richard. Well, this doppelganger, Ricky, just happened to be sent to the same prison that Richard was at for a totally unrelated crime. These two men have never met, there's no connection whatsoever, they just look the same. And when Richard looked across the cafeteria and saw Ricky, it was like looking at a clone of himself, and it all clicked. All the people that were coming up to him saying, "You were doing this and acting weird," well, those people, Stephen included, were actually interacting with his doppelganger, Ricky. And 16 years earlier, Ricky was the one who committed that robbery in Walmart, and the victim and the witnesses, they all confused Ricky for Richard. Once a judge was made aware of this situation and saw the two photos side by side, he knew the police had made a mistake. Even the prosecutor who had tried Richard in the robbery case supported his release. Richard was freed in 2017 and got a $1 million settlement from the state. As for the doppelganger, Ricky Amos, he was never actually tried for the robbery 16 years earlier because by the time they figured out he was the robber, the case was too old to try. Our next story is called Lucky Shot. There is a very popular TV show on HBO called Curb Your Enthusiasm, and it's about the mega famous Larry David who created Seinfeld. And so Curb Your Enthusiasm is totally a satire. It's a comedy, it's about Larry David. And in fact, Larry David plays himself in the show, but Larry David in the show is a very exaggerated version of himself in real life. But the show is shot to look like it's almost biographical, but it's not. It's totally comedy. Apparently, in real life, Larry is known for getting into kind of funny, awkward situations, often that he brings on himself. And so on the show, basically every episode, Larry David finds himself getting into totally absurd situations that just get worse and worse and worse because Larry just makes all the wrong decisions. And so it's a really funny show. However, there is one particular episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm that will go down as the single episode virtually everyone who has ever watched the show will remember, and it's not because it was funny. It's because this particular episode had massive ripple effects that nobody from Larry David to writers to producers, anybody involved with this production could have predicted. The episode in question is called The Carpool Lane, and in this episode, Larry David, the character, is late to a baseball game at Dodger Stadium. And so he's stuck in traffic and he's totally upset. And then he has this idea that if he picks up this sex worker who's right outside his car, that if she gets in the car with him, he'll now have 2 passengers in his car and therefore will be eligible to use the carpool lane that currently nobody else was using in this traffic jam. And so that would allow him to get to Dodger Stadium faster. And so he hires this sex worker and she gets in the car and Larry kind of awkwardly explains his plan. And then he hops in the carpool lane. He makes his way to Dodger Stadium. The plan works great. And when he gets there, he actually ends up bringing the sex worker with him into the stadium just to enjoy the game with him. And so he goes up, they find their seats, and their seats are just so bad. But as they're sitting there and Larry's totally upset about how bad his seats are, Larry happens to see one of his friends who's also at this Dodgers game, and Larry can tell, his friend has great seats. And so the rest of the episode is basically Larry going down and trying to convince his friend to give up his seats for Larry and his sex worker to watch the game, and his friend just continuously says no. And so really that's the gist of the episode, and you can see how it kind of gets more and more ridiculous, and it gets really funny, but it's pretty typical writing for this show. This was not like a special show in any way. It was just kind of par for the course, Curb Your Enthusiasm. That is, until a lawyer named Todd Melnick heard about it. In the fall of 2003, this lawyer, Todd Melnick, called HBO and said he needed to see the raw footage from the episode they shot called A Carpool Lane. A producer at HBO named Tim Gibbons is the one who answered this call, and his first reaction was, we can't let you see this footage because this episode hasn't even aired yet, and so you're going to have to wait the couple of months until this episode comes out if you want to see this footage. But Tim quickly noticed that Todd Melnick, the lawyer, was not about to give up this easily. He was adamant that he had to see this footage right now. And so eventually, Tim Gibbons actually would go and find Larry David, and he would ask Larry, hey, do you mind if this random lawyer comes and watches this footage from this unaired episode? And Larry was like, okay. And so the next day, Todd Melnick showed up at HBO, and he was led into this small room with a TV, and Tim, the producer he spoke to, as well as Larry David and a few other people from the Curb Your Enthusiasm production, they all filed into this room, and all of them just sat down, and then they began playing the footage, the raw footage from the Carpool Lane episode. And as they watched this footage, which was hours and hours and hours long, the lawyer, Todd Melnick, is watching the footage and just kind of slumping into his chair, just seeming like what he was watching was making him more and more unhappy. That clearly, he was looking for something and he was not seeing it in this footage. But finally, when one of the producers put in the fifth and final tape of raw footage from this episode, Todd Melnick, as he's sitting there watching the footage, which looks basically like Larry walking up and down the steps at Dodger Stadium over and over again, and him also walking in and out of his aisle, they reshot the scene of him sitting down inside of his crappy seats. Todd's watching this over and over again, and then suddenly he sits up and he points at the screen and goes, right there. It would turn out Todd Melnick was investigating a murder case. The murder happened on May 12, 2003. A 16-year-old girl named Martha Puebla was standing in front of her house in a neighborhood in Los Angeles when she was shot by gang members because apparently a rumor had gotten out that Martha was snitching on gang members, and so she was killed. And the police actually had already made an arrest in this murder. They had arrested a guy named Juan Catalan. Juan's brother, Mario, was on trial for a different murder, and just 2 weeks before Martha's murder, Martha testified in Mario's case. And who was in the audience listening to Martha's damning testimony about Mario? Well, Mario's brother, Juan. And so prosecutors believed this was the motive for Juan to kill Martha. Also, there was an eyewitness to Martha's murder, and the sketch artist who worked with this eyewitness came up with a composite sketch of Martha's killer that looked exactly like Juan. And so now Juan was potentially facing the death penalty if he was found guilty. But Juan was adamant that he did not kill Martha, and on the night of her murder, he said he was at the Dodgers game where they were filming a Curb Your Enthusiasm episode. But nobody believed him except for his lawyer, Todd Melnick, who called HBO, got access to all that unseen footage from the episode, and after watching for hours and hours and hours, finally that fifth tape goes in, and sure enough, Todd Melnick watched as his client, Juan Catalan, strolled right into frame and sat down with his daughter. It would turn out Juan was telling the truth the whole time, he did not kill Martha, and Curb Your Enthusiasm proved it. Shortly after this discovery, Juan would be released from prison and he would receive a settlement of $320,000 from the city of Los Angeles and the police. As for Martha, the police were able to eventually track down 4 people who were involved in her murder, and all 4 would be convicted and sent to jail for life.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Familiar Face.
On the morning of February 25th, 2015, in a little house in the city of Cape Town in South Africa, a 17-year-old girl named Misha Solomon was packing up her homework in between bites of her breakfast. And as she did this, her mother, Lavana, walked into the kitchen with a big smile on her face, and she was holding up this beautiful red flowing dress, and immediately Misha knew what it was. Her mom had been making this dress by hand over the past couple of days. It was for a big school dance that was coming up, and she saw that it was now done.
And so Misha, she put down her breakfast and her homework, and she rushed over to her mom, and she admired this gorgeous dress and thanked her mom for all the hard work and said it's absolutely perfect. And then from somewhere behind Misha, her father, who was still sitting at the table, kind of grunted out, "Hey, isn't that dress a little bit revealing?" And Misha and her mom kind of just rolled their eyes because they knew Misha's dad just loved his daughter and was very, very protective of her. And so basically anything she wore that wasn't full coverage was too revealing. And so Misha, after rolling her eyes, walked over to her dad. She gave him a big hug and a kiss, and she said, "Dad, don't worry about it. It's just fine." And so after that, Misha went back to her breakfast, she finished eating, she packed up her stuff, and then she gave her mom and her dad another hug and a kiss and said goodbye, and then she headed out the front door out to the road where her aunt was waiting in her car. As Misha's aunt drove her to school like she did almost every single morning, Misha began to notice her aunt was acting kind of strange and constantly looking behind her and looking in her rearview mirror. And finally, Misha said to her aunt, "What's going on? What are you looking at back there?" And Misha's aunt would say, "I know this sounds crazy, but I'm pretty sure there's a white car that's following me. And in fact, over the past couple of days, I've seen what I think is this same white car following us anytime I'm driving you to school." And so Misha just turned around in her seat and looked out the back window, and she saw there were dozens of white cars on the road, so it was pretty difficult to tell which one her aunt was talking about. But as she's looking, none of the cars seemed suspicious, and so Misha turned back around and told her aunt, "I think you're just being paranoid. Nobody's following us. There's no reason to follow us." A few minutes later, Misha's aunt pulled up alongside the front of the school, and Misha said goodbye to her aunt, she thanked her, she hopped outside, and she rushed into the school. And then Misha made her way up to the hallway where her first class was, and as she was walking down the hallway, her best friend, Cassidy Nurse, was walking up the hallway in her direction. And so right away, Misha sees Cassidy and she waves and smiles and begins walking towards her. But Cassidy gave Misha this kind of weird, lukewarm smile and then quickly looked away from Misha, and then Cassidy turned and bolted into the nearest classroom. And so Misha just came to a stop and just looked at the doorway where her best friend has disappeared, and she starts thinking to herself, what's going on? Why did she do that? That was so cold. And then Misha began to think about the fact that actually, over the past couple of days, Cassidy had been acting really strange. It was like she was trying to avoid Misha, but Misha had no idea why. It wasn't like they were fighting. Normally, Misha and Cassidy were totally inseparable. They had met earlier that school year, and even though they were actually kind of far apart in age, Cassidy was in 8th grade and Misha was in 12th grade, it was like it didn't matter. It was like right away when they met each other, they had this special bond where they just had to be around each other all the time, they shared everything with each other, and certainly anytime they saw each other in the hallway, they would stop to chat or even go into a nearby bathroom and do each other's hair and makeup and share any gossip they had recently heard. So for Cassidy to act like this was just totally uncharacteristic, and it really upset Misha. But just then, the bell rang in the school, so Misha knew at this point she was now late for her class, and so she had to forget about whatever was going on with Cassidy, and Misha just hustled down the hallway and went into her classroom. And so Misha, she takes her seat at her desk, she puts her stuff down, and she's getting ready to listen to the teacher, when suddenly the principal comes in without even knocking, and without even saying anything to Misha's teacher, the principal walks right up to Misha and says, "I need you to come with me." And right away, Misha's classmates, all who saw this, they begin oohing and awing as if Misha is in huge trouble. But Misha's thinking to herself, I didn't do anything. I have no idea what this is about. And so she kind of smiled like it was no big deal. She picked up her stuff and she followed the principal out into the hallway. But as Misha followed the principal down the hallway towards the principal's office, Misha's smile faded and she began to wonder, what is this about? What's going on? And then finally they got to the principal's office. The principal opened up the door. Misha went in first and the principal trailed behind her and shut the door behind them. When Misha looked into the principal's office, she saw there were already 2 people inside who she didn't recognize. It was 2 women who were very serious looking, who were sitting on the side of the room. And as soon as Misha walked in, the 2 women, without introducing themselves, just told Misha to come over and take a seat next to them. And Misha, instead of doing that, just paused and looked at the women and said, "What's going on?" And at this, the two women kind of looked at each other, and then one of the women piped up and said, "Misha, we're here because the police sent us. And they sent us because of a photo that you and your very close friend Cassidy took." But before Misha could ask any questions like, "What photo are you talking about? And really what's going on here?" these two women would explain the whole situation to Misha. And basically what they did is they told her this long, very convoluted story that involved Misha, it involved Cassidy, it involved this photo. And by the end of this story, this explainer story, Misha had taken a seat and put her hand over her mouth in utter disbelief. And then when the women were done explaining everything, Misha had a million questions, but it was like she was so overwhelmed with what she was just told that she just continued to sit there with her hand over her mouth, totally silent. And then finally, Misha did break the silence by saying, "Can I please just call my parents?" And at this, the social workers said, "No, you can't. And in fact, the police are already at your parents' house. They're talking to your parents right now. And so you can't talk to them. You can't even go home. In fact, you have to come with us for tonight." And then the two women got up and they made their way out of the principal's office. And they said, "Come on, Misha, you have to come with us." And so Misha stood up and she's totally flabbergasted. She really is like, how is this real life? And the principal at this point walked over and gave Misha a hug. And it was like suddenly the floodgates opened and Misha just began sobbing hysterically. And as she did, the social workers just stood there waiting patiently. And then as soon as it seemed like Misha was done crying, they said, "Come on, you really need to come with us." And so Misha, she let go of the principal and she followed the two women out of the school out to one of their cars. And once they got in the car, the two women explained to Misha that they were going to take her to a safe house for the night. But before they went to the safe house, they would need to make a quick pit stop at a local medical clinic. And so Misha, who at this point is not even asking questions, just said, okay. And so the women, they drove to the medical clinic. They were inside for just a matter of minutes. When they came back out again, they drove the rest of the way to the safe house. And when they got to the safe house, it just looked like a normal house on the outside. But on the inside, when the two women were leading Misha through and showing her where everything was, the kitchen, the bathroom, her bedroom, all Misha saw was all these other kids who were staying there, who were orphaned and abandoned. And it started to give Misha a panic attack. And she asked the women again, "Can I please call my parents?" And they said, "No, you really can't." But one of the two social workers could tell that Misha, she's having a breakdown. This is the worst day of her life, very likely. And so one of the two women actually offered to Misha to come home with her and stay at her house instead of the safe house, and Misha agreed. And so that social worker and Misha, they would leave together, they would get into that woman's car, and they would drive to her house. And then the social worker told Misha that unfortunately now it was just a waiting game. They needed to wait for the police to get back in touch with them with more information. That night, as Misha lay in this woman's guest bedroom, looking up at the ceiling, wondering how the heck this had become her life, she began to think about the photo that her and Cassidy had took that had kind of started this whole horrible thing. And so Misha began to think about the day they took this picture, and all she remembered was that she and Cassidy were just kind of goofing around and smiling and making funny faces and just taking photos as they went. She certainly didn't think that one of those pictures they took would totally change her life. The following morning, when Misha woke up, the social worker brought her to their office, the social worker's office, and there they met with the other woman who had first met Misha in the principal's office, and the three of them just sat in the office, not talking much, eating chicken wings and other snacks, just literally waiting for police to call them. And finally, they would call. And when they did, one of the social workers answered the phone, and as she listened to what she was being told, she began to frown, and by the time she hung up, she was crying. The news from the police was the news Misha had been afraid of ever since sitting in the principal's office the day before and hearing this whole crazy story about her and Cassidy and this photo. The special pit stop that Misha and the social workers made at the medical clinic the day before on the way to the safe house was so that Misha could get a DNA test. And now the police were calling back with the results of the test. And what the results showed was Misha Solomon was not actually Misha Solomon. Her real name was Zephany Nurse. 17 years earlier, Zephany Nurse had been stolen out of her crib at the hospital in Cape Town, and despite a massive manhunt for her, she was never found. And so this was a huge, famous case in Cape Town, and most people assumed it would never be solved. But Misha's DNA had done just that. It proved that Misha's parents, who had loved her and raised her since she was a baby, were not actually her parents. Her mother, Lavana, was actually her kidnapper, and now she was under arrest. But even though this revelation was incredibly shocking and upsetting for Misha, it was not nearly as shocking as learning the identity of her real biological parents. The social workers took Misha from their office to the police station, where they told Misha her real biological parents were waiting to meet her. And so once they went inside the police station, Misha gripped onto the social worker's arm tightly. She was incredibly nervous, and she was led down a hallway to a door that was shut. And then finally, when Misha was ready, she pushed the door open, and her real parents, who were sitting right in front of her, they stood up and they ran towards her crying. But Misha just stood there, stunned and silent, staring at them. Because these people, they were not strangers to her. She knew them extremely well. They were the parents of her best friend in the world, Cassidy Nurse. Which meant Misha, aka Zephany Nurse, was Cassidy's sister. Months earlier, when Misha and Cassidy first met each other, the reason they hit it off so quickly, and the reason they had similar senses of humor and liked the same things, and looked so dramatically similar, is because they were literally sisters. They just didn't know it. And then one day they took a series of selfie photos of themselves, and Cassidy, she would go home and show one of those photos to her parents and say, hey, look, my best friend, Misha Solomon, look how similar we look. And when Cassidy's parents looked at Misha Solomon, they instinctively knew that is our daughter. That is Zephany Nurse. And so they would bring this photo to the police, and the police would begin to investigate. And during this investigation, they began trailing Misha. So when Misha's aunt told Misha that she thought a white car was following her, she wasn't just being paranoid. Those were investigators following Misha around, trying to get a feel for her schedule, because they needed to approach her when she was alone in order to get a DNA sample. They were worried if they contacted Misha and tipped off what they were doing, she would tell her parents, who were actually her kidnappers, and then potentially they might take Misha and run away. And so they couldn't risk that. They had to basically follow her around and wait for an opening to get this DNA test done. And so this was also the reason why Cassidy was acting so strangely towards Misha in the few days before the truth was revealed. It's because Cassidy knew about this investigation, and the police told her, you can't tip Misha off. She will tell her parents, her kidnappers, and they might abscond with her. And so Cassidy basically felt awkward and kind of just hid from Misha for a couple of days. The woman that Misha had grown up with and called her mom for her whole life, Lavana Solomon, was ultimately convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 10 years in prison. There has never been any evidence to suggest that Lavana's husband, so Misha's dad for her whole life, actually knew that the baby had been kidnapped, because 17 years earlier, Lavana had been pregnant with their child. But it's believed she miscarried, and Lavana did not share that with her husband. Instead, she told her husband that she had gone into labor while he was at work and delivered their child, and so that's how they had this baby, Zephany, when in reality, after Lavana had miscarried, she had at some point dressed up like a nurse, gone into the hospital, and stolen Zephany. For her part, Zephany, aka Misha, stayed in touch with both sets of parents, the fake ones and her biological ones. And she would say that, she still loves the parents who kidnapped her because they raised her and they treated her well. And in fact, Zephany would actually wear that beautiful flowing red dress that Lavana had stitched for her to her high school dance, well after the news came out about who Lavana was. Misha also decided that she would just keep the name Misha because that was what she was used to, instead of going back to her baby name, Zephany.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, Mr. Ballin Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate